So we've been looking at this theme of solitude and loneliness. To some degree, we can say there's a choice. Nobody chooses to be lonely, but as came out in the conversations you had in the small groups yesterday, there is a choice involved, a will involved in solitude, an embracing of solitude. And we can think of solitude in that sense, which is our being alone together, discovering that we exist in the web of relationships that we call God, that is love, that we live and move and have our being in this network or this web of love. That is our true place, our true home, our truth, our true self. And we have to recognize that, we have to awaken to that. And that is our work, that is our life, that is our meaning. And if we fail to do that, we descend into hell, we descend into loneliness. There are degrees of hell, there are degrees of loneliness. They can be extreme, they can be very self-destructive, they can completely overwhelm us and become delusional and lead to complete self-destruction. But there are, minor levels of loneliness as well, or less extreme forms, which can, in a sense, be useful, or what Julian of Norwich says, behovely. Sin is behovely, she says. And by behovely, it's an old English word that means necessary or useful, or can be turned to advantage. Nobody would choose to be lonely, but discovering that you are lonely can be a wake-up call to that level of suffering, can waken you to the need to want an awakened mind, to want to be more conscious, more alive, more awake, and then, of course, lead you also to make a decision about it and to do something about it. So that's what we've been looking at, and trying to connect that to the fundamental truth of the gospel, which is to love one another. What does that mean? And why is it so central? Why is it the only thing that Jesus actually tells us? Essentially, it's the commandment of the gospel to learn, to love, to commit ourselves to love each other as he has loved us. So we're looking at that teaching on selflessness, on other-centeredness, on learning to love, as taking us to the very core of what our meaning consists in and what it means to be human. And to help us to understand that, we've been looking also at the Buddhist wisdom in this area, very complementary, very resonant with what we find in the gospel. Of course, it's a universal wisdom. In the same way that if you, you break your bone or you have a appendicitis in Asia or in Europe or in Africa, and you go to get the help that you can at the nearest, from the nearest source, and you don't say, oh, I'll have to wait till I go back home before I do my appendicitis. These are the body and its ailments are universal. And so you can be treated as well by an African doctor as you could by a Irish nurse. So in the same way, we can think of the wisdom that relates to the healing of the human condition as a universal wisdom. It doesn't reduce all religions to some kind of anonymous, amorphous, shapeless sort of thing, because religious traditions are also touched very much by culture and by conditioning. But nevertheless, there's clearly a core wisdom at work in the human family. So we can be helped by understanding the core wisdom of our own tradition by seeing it and resonating with it in other traditions. So we've been looking at the particular wisdom relating to the bodhisattva way of life, which is a way of life in which you dedicate yourself to relieving the suffering of others. And that's your goal, that's your primary goal, to love one another. So we've been looking at this, and I think we need to go a little bit more now into how do we do it? How do we develop that frame of mind? How do we stay in that frame of mind? We all have our good moments when we feel selfless and altruistic and generous, but often they fade after a while when we become afflicted by some suffering or by some loss or by a change of mood or whatever it may be. We seem to lose that perception of reality, that insight into our true nature. So these are important practical questions of any spiritual path. If we see life as a spiritual path, then it obviously concerns us, how do we grow in that and stabilize that state of mind? At first we may be very intermittent, it may just flicker on and off for a bit, but we know that that is true, that we know that is right, and we know that it makes us feel better and the world a better place. So how do we sustain it and how do we stabilize it? And the reason we can give serious attention to this intention is because we see that life itself is a spiritual path. It's not that we have a spiritual path in life. You know, if we can make a little time available for our spiritual life in the course of our many demands, our career and our the other demands, and for entertainment and for fun and for all the other things that we want to pack into our life. So it's not that we wouldn't be here, we wouldn't be making this step from desiring an awakening mind to actually doing the work of awakening it. We probably wouldn't be on a retreat like this at all if we hadn't already begun to see that the spiritual path is our life. It's not just a particular optional extra, as it were, in our life. So how do we develop it? How do we stabilize it? How do we grow in it? Well, one of the ways I mentioned yesterday is what the Buddhists would call taking refuge. We take refuge in the embodiment of that goal, in what or the person who embodies it for us. And in the Christian understanding, that would be following Jesus. Whoever wants to be my disciple must renounce himself, take up his cross, and follow me. That's the Christian refuge. Now, that can be wrongly interpreted, especially with the word cross in there, as inevitably involving some kind of commitment to suffering. And we'll look at this question in a little bit more detail later, but it's not that Jesus is saying, I want you to be crucified, and the more you're crucified, the more you suffer, the closer you can come to me or to your goal, in which case discipleship would be some kind of self-harm or seeking suffering willingly, and thinking that the more we suffer, the closer we come to God. Simone Weil, who understood suffering very well, said that we should avoid any suffering we can legitimately avoid. We should avoid it. But that which we cannot avoid, we should accept. We should embrace. And she even goes so far as to say, and I think the Buddhist texts, some of them we've looked at, or actually maybe it was the Gita this morning, also say the same thing. We have to look equally upon the pleasant and the unpleasant, upon the sweet and the sour, upon the painful and the joyful. There's a certain perspective, there's a certain point of view that we can find in ourselves, a certain place in ourselves where we can do that. Doesn't mean that we prefer suffering, but it means that in the moment we can accept equally the suffering or the joy that life will bring us. So I think this is, in a way, what Jesus is calling us to, not to seek to be crucified, but when life does bring us to suffering, we embrace it, we accept it, and go through it, and can be transformed by it. And then, as I said, the yoke becomes easy and the burden light. It's not actually as bad as it seems. And we are able to go through the dark nights of our experience, the losses, the fear of death, sickness of body or of mind. We can go through that better, as it were, than we had imagined we would be able to. So we begin then to do something about it. We begin to do the work necessary to awaken the mind. And as soon as we do that, we become aware of the difference between the ideal, this wonderful ideal of loving our neighbor, loving our enemies as ourself, the wonderful ideal of the bodhisattva to be totally committed to the relieving of suffering anywhere it exists. That's a beautiful, wonderful, inspiring ideal. And then we come down to earth with a bump as we discover our own failings, our own weaknesses, our own faults. One of the best ways that we have one that every tradition, every spiritual wisdom has discovered to deal with those faults is to confess them. Whether you go into a confessional and confess it, or whether you go to a therapist and talk about it, or whether you sit with your friend and open your heart to them, one way or another, we need to confess our faults. And in that confession, we often call it sharing, but it's a little bit more than just sharing. We are not trying to impress anyone. One of the little games that the religious ego plays, of course, is to try to impress your confessor with how many wonderful sins you've committed, and that you must be one of the most interesting sinners that he or she has ever encountered. The other extreme is where the process of confession becomes really just very mechanical and superficial, as it became for many Catholics in the past. We haven't quite recovered yet the meaning of the sacrament of reconciliation. But we were coming close to it, I think, with the idea of the general confession, or was it not the general confession, but the group, sort of group confession, which became very popular some years ago and then was forbidden. So there's the other extreme where it becomes very mechanical, very superficial, just a matter of routine. Catholics used to do it every Saturday. There was probably every Saturday before they went out. So you kind of like pay off your credit card for that week, and then you can go into debt again. I was once helping in a church, and somebody came into the confessional. I couldn't see them, and they just sat there I suppose they sat there very quietly, didn't say anything. So I said, hello, and they said, hello. And I said, thought we might be nervous or upset about something. So I said, how are you doing? Fine. So I said, anything on your mind? Nope. So I said, okay, would you like to go to confession? Yes. And I said, he didn't say anything. So I said, why have you come? And he said, just to reconnect. Which is not altogether such a bad thing, but the deeper meaning of confession, I think, is that we are not just doing a mechanical routine, sort of keeping our guilt under control, but nor are we playing a game and dramatizing ourselves in front of God or in front of whoever. The purpose of the confession is, in a trusting and safe and confidential environment, to be able to see ourselves, to come to self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is the basis of our knowledge of God. To see our egotism and not to be frightened or embarrassed by it. To see the patterns that may, of character, of mind, of behavior, or addiction, that may be controlling us or limiting our freedom, or maybe causing us extreme pain. And to know that, to be given hope and encouragement that we can free ourselves from this kind of bondage. Even the idea of sacrificing ourselves can be a trap for the ego. It can lead to a certain type of sort of false bodhisattva ideal where you sacrifice yourself for others even though they don't want you to. But your way of sacrificing yourself for them is a way of controlling them and possessing them or dominating them. So we all need continuous recalibration. We need to be continually rebalancing and clarifying what it is we're doing, because we all have faults, we all have weaknesses, we all have little traps that we set for ourselves that we need to be made conscious of. And confession of some kind, which brings us to that humility or that self-knowledge that allows us to keep on the way. The idea that in some way we can offer something to God in order to get something back is one of the traps that the ego sets for us. In other words, we can bargain with God in some way. This is the ego staying in control of the awakening mind, or the ego staying in control of the loving relationships that we want to develop. Simone Weil says that we only have one thing to offer God, and that is the acknowledgement that only God has being, has full being. What we offer God then is our illusion that we are autonomous, that we are self-sufficient, that we are independent, that we exist in our own right against God, and that therefore we could do a transaction or we could bargain with God in some way, that God is another being to whom we can relate. So the only thing we have to offer, according to Simone Weil, and I think it's what we offer in meditation, the only thing we have to offer is that illusion. And in offering that, in facing it, in confessing that we are frequently controlled by that delusion, and we cling to that illusion that we have this sort of ego identity, which is, if not equal to God, at least, God has to take it seriously and listen to us when we discuss a deal with Him. So all of these are all aspects of what it means to move to that second step and doing something about it. Committing ourselves to this awakening mind, to take refuge, to be a disciple. Even though this commitment to live life as a spiritual path, come what may, even though that commitment is going to bring us into immediate contact with failure, with our own human weakness and inconstancy. And what the great wisdom traditions tell us is that this is not a problem. It's only a problem, failure is only a problem if the ego feels ashamed or wants to conceal it, and even to conceal it from ourselves, as the hypocrite does or the Pharisee does. That's the only reason that failure, weakness, would be a problem. If we can confess it, that means, first of all, acknowledge it for ourselves and to ourselves, and that may well mean that we have to acknowledge it or speak about it with someone else, then, however weak or inconstant we may be, even our failures can become a grace. Our failures become a way of helping us to love others and relieve the suffering of others. I mean, a little example of this, somebody working in a big corporation told me that one of the things that he'd learnt over time through meditation in the way he worked, and like many people, he spent more time at work than he did with his family. And it was a very important part of his life and his identity. And he said, as he moved up the hierarchy, as he became, more powerful, more important, it seemed to him that he had to hide his doubts or his weaknesses or the mistakes that he made frequently, which we all make. Although he was learning skills and learning expertise over time, and like all of us, learning through mistakes, but he didn't want to acknowledge those mistakes. And he felt that to acknowledge them to his subordinates would be a sign of weakness. And this created, a high level of stress and anxiety within him, because where you have to continually put on a good front in order to be able to control or impress other people. And then he said, gradually he began to realize that this was not necessary. And he found, and he said meditation brought him to this humility, that he could simply acknowledge to his subordinates at a meeting, I was wrong. You were right. So let's change what we were doing and do it the way you suggested. And not only did this make him feel better, but it made the people he was working with feel better as well, because they didn't have to pretend to relate to this perfect figure who they knew actually, of course, wasn't perfect. And that their relationship became much more real and more enjoyable, and they began to collaborate more. It didn't weaken his authority, but it strengthened it. So, this is simply an example of what the wisdom, the spiritual traditions teach us about the importance of confessing, acknowledging, being open about our faults. On the other hand, you don't want to go to the other extreme and then just speak with people endlessly about how bad you are, and how many mistakes you've made. But perfectionism, any idea that we have to be perfect or that we have to pretend to be perfect, this affects everybody in any form of service to others. It could be in healthcare, it could be in teaching, it could be in parenting, it could be in spiritual or religious relationships. Any idea that we have to be perfect or pretend to be perfect undermines the relationship and therefore the work that we are doing. And it undermines our commitment to the spiritual path that life is. The goal of the wisdom of confession, of acknowledgement, of humility, is that we can become more useful to other people. Not just that we grow in our own private rating on the spiritual path, we become 5-star enlightened people, but it's that we become more useful. That's the primary touchstone. We become more useful to other people. Whereas Shantideva says, I am medicine for the sick. I become medicine for those who need healing. And this resonates with what the Cloud of Unknowing says about the work of meditation. He says this work that you are doing in meditation brings benefits to others in ways you will never be able to imagine. The person I just mentioned was able to see the benefit it brought to his work conditions and the people and his team. But the Cloud of Unknowing goes much deeper than that. It says this work that you are doing touches into that universal web of relationships in which we are all connected to all in ways that we cannot objectify and cannot imagine.